The rope had been tied with care, not the careless knot of panic or haste, but the kind that suggested someone had taken time to make sure it would hold. And Clara Wynne felt that intention in the steady pressure against her wrists as she stood beside the post, head lowered, boots planted in dirt she no longer felt she had any claim to. The town had gathered without urgency, their voices low and measured, as if what was happening required patience rather than doubt. And Clara listened to them speak about her in the third person, weighing her usefulness and her cost with the same tone used for damaged goods. She had stopped arguing long before the rope was brought out, because every word she offered only confirmed what they already believed, that defending herself was further proof she did not understand her place. When Eli Mercer rode in, his arrival barely registered at first, just another rancher passing through, until the horse slowed and stopped, and the small shift of attention rippled outward as people noticed that someone had chosen to look instead of pass by. Eli took in the scene without expression, his gaze moving from the knot at Clara's wrists to the post, then to the faces around them, reading not anger but comfort, the ease of people certain their decision would not be challenged. Clara lifted her eyes only when she sensed him near, and when their gazes met, she did not plead or protest, only whispered the truth she had come to believe, that she was not worth the trouble, offering him a way to turn away before the moment asked too much of him. Eli felt the weight of that sentence settle heavily because it carried the sound of repetition, of something learned slowly and confirmed often, and he understood that whatever accusation had been made mattered less than the damage already done. He stepped closer without raising his voice, his movements deliberate enough that no one could claim surprise, and when his hand went to his coat, the town stiffened, expecting argument or warning, but the knife appeared briefly and cleanly, its edge catching light only once before it slid through the rope. The sound it made was small, almost private, yet the effect was immediate, a sharp intake of breath from the crowd, a murmur that broke their certainty into fragments. Clara did not move at first, unsure whether freedom was permitted without permission, until Eli placed himself between her and the post, his presence firm and unyielding, and told her simply to step away. She stumbled, unsteady not from pain but disbelief, and Eli steadied her at the elbow without ceremony, as if this were an ordinary thing that required no explanation. Voices rose then, confusion and outrage tangling together, but Eli did not answer them, guiding Clara toward his horse and the open road beyond the square, understanding that the true conflict had only begun. As they moved, Clara realized with a quiet shock that the rope had not only been holding her, but the story the town told itself about who deserved mercy. And by cutting it, Eli Mercer had changed not just her fate, but the shape of what would follow for them both. They did not get far before the sound of pursuit reached them, boots scraping dirt, a voice calling Eli Mercer's name with the strained politeness people used when they wanted obedience without admitting it. And Clara Wynne felt her body tense instinctively, every step away from the post sharpening her awareness that freedom rarely went unchallenged. Eli did not hurry the horse, knowing speed invited chase, and instead walked with deliberate calm, his hand steady at the reins, as if leaving the square were no more remarkable than arriving, because panic would only give the town the certainty it lacked. Someone stepped into the road ahead of them, demanding an explanation, citing order and consequence, and Eli answered only by stopping long enough to meet the man's eyes and state plainly that Clara was leaving with him, offering no justification beyond the decision itself. The simplicity of it unsettled them more than argument would have, because it left no opening to negotiate terms, and as they moved on, Clara felt the strange disorientation of being defended without condition, unsure whether to brace for the moment it would be withdrawn. Once they cleared the first rise and the town dropped from view, the tension shifted, no longer public but personal, and Clara found herself walking beside the horse, uncertain whether she was allowed to sit, to ask questions, or to claim space she had been denied for so long. Eli sensed it without looking back, and told her she could ride if she needed to, not as permission but as fact. And when she climbed up with careful hands, the height felt unfamiliar, like standing in a place she had been told was not meant for her. The road stretched ahead, open and exposed, and Clara listened for the sound of riders behind them, her mind rehearsing apologies she would not speak, because habit insisted trouble must be repaid. Eli spoke then, not to reassure but to orient her, telling her where they were headed and how long it would take, giving her information rather than promises, and Clara realized how rarely she had been given either. When they reached a bend where the trees closed in and the path narrowed, Eli dismounted briefly to check the ground, reading tracks with a quiet efficiency that told her he expected pursuit, just not immediately, and the awareness made her chest tighten with guilt she could not name. She told him again that she wasn't worth the trouble, that whatever they accused her of was easier to leave behind than fight, and the words came out automatically, shaped by years of being moved along before inconvenience hardened into anger. Eli stopped then and faced her fully, not with anger or softness, but with a steadiness that did not allow retreat, and told her that trouble chosen was different from trouble inherited, and that the moment he cut the rope, the trouble became his by choice. The statement settled into her slowly as they continued on, because it rewrote the logic she had survived by, replacing endurance with something more dangerous, the possibility that protection did not require her to be worthy of it first. As the road climbed and the light shifted, Clara Wynne understood that the rope had been only the beginning, and that whatever followed would test not just Eli's resolve, but her ability to live without shrinking back into the place the town had assigned her. By the time the road narrowed into scrub and broken ground, Clara Wynne felt the full weight of what it meant to be taken along rather than sent away, because silence stretched differently when it was not enforced, and every mile carried the question she did not yet know how to ask. Eli Mercer moved with the practiced ease of a man who understood distance and consequence, choosing paths that bent away from settlements and slowing only when the land demanded it, and Clara watched him from the saddle, uncertain where to rest her hands, her body still braced for correction that never came. She noticed how he checked behind them without alarm, how he read the ground not as threat, but as information, and the calm of it unsettled her more than anger ever had, because it suggested he had already accepted what might follow. When they stopped to water the horse near a shallow creek, Clara dismounted carefully, half expecting to be told where to stand or what to do, and when no instruction came, she folded her arms tightly, as if holding herself in place were the only task she could trust. Eli filled his canteen and handed it to her without comment, and the simple act of being offered something without condition made her throat tighten in a way she struggled to hide. She drank quickly and returned it, murmuring thanks out of habit, and Eli nodded once, neither encouraging nor dismissing the gratitude, as though he understood that some habits took time to loosen. As they continued on, Clara spoke hesitantly about the town, about how the rope had come after weeks of suspicion and quiet decisions made without her, and Eli listened without interrupting, not correcting her language or asking for names, and that restraint allowed her to finish without shrinking the truth to fit his comfort. She admitted then that she expected him to leave her somewhere once the immediate trouble passed, because that was how such things usually ended, protection given only long enough to restore order before the burden was set down again. Eli answered without slowing that he did not take people from places only to abandon them on the road, and the certainty in his voice carried no promise of ease, only continuity, and Clara felt something uncoil slightly in her chest. When a distant rider appeared briefly on a ridge behind them, Eli altered their path without comment, guiding the horse into thicker cover until the shape disappeared, and the ease with which he did it told Clara that he had anticipated pursuit without being ruled by it. The realization settled heavily, because it meant she was no longer a problem being solved quickly, but a responsibility being carried forward deliberately. As evening approached and the light softened, Clara Wynne understood that being taken along required something of her as well, not repayment or obedience, but the harder task of remaining present without apologizing for the space she now occupied. And as Eli led them onward with the same steady pace, she began, cautiously, to let the road belong to her too. They made camp before night fully settled, not because exhaustion forced it, but because Eli Mercer chose the place with intention, a shallow draw shielded from wind and distant enough from the road that curiosity would pass without pausing. Clara Wynne watched him work, the practiced economy of his movements quietly declaring that stopping here was not hesitation, but preparation, and she felt the unease that came when no one explained their decisions to her, leaving her to learn a different way of understanding safety. The fire was small and controlled, giving off just enough light to be useful without advertising their position. And as Eli set the pot to warm, Clara realized how accustomed she was to being told what each pause meant, whether it was punishment or permission. Here, the road refused to explain itself, and that uncertainty pressed against old habits that urged her to stay silent and small. She offered to help, and then stopped herself, unsure whether the offer would be taken as intrusion. But Eli nodded and handed her a task without ceremony, neither testing nor correcting her, and the simple act of being included without evaluation loosened something tight behind her ribs. As they ate, Clara spoke quietly about the accusation that had followed her through the town, a debt that was never proven, a loss that needed a culprit. And Eli listened with the same steadiness he had shown since cutting the rope, making no effort to balance the story or assign blame, only acknowledging the weight of being judged without voice. When the fire burned down to coals, Clara's thoughts drifted back to the post, to the moment she had been told to wait, and then told to accept what waiting meant, and she admitted aloud that she had expected him to turn back once the town was out of sight. Eli answered without looking up that the road was not a place to discard people, and the finality of the statement left no room for negotiation or gratitude. Later, as darkness settled and the sounds of night replaced the echo of the town, Clara lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar quiet, aware that safety, when not enforced or explained, demanded something new of her, the courage to exist without rehearsing an ending. Eli kept watch without spectacle, his presence steady and unremarkable, and Clara understood then that the road did not owe her clarity or reassurance, only continuity, and that for the first time, continuity was being offered without conditions attached. Morning came clear and cold, the kind that sharpened sound and distance, and Clara Wynne woke with the familiar expectation that daylight would bring instruction, judgment, or the quiet withdrawal of protection. But Eli Mercer was already moving about the camp with the same steady purpose as the night before, as if staying had never been a question to reconsider. He handed her a cup of warmed water and spoke about the route ahead, not as reassurance but as fact, explaining where the ground would turn rocky and where they would need to slow, and the simple inclusion of her in those calculations made her realize how rarely she had been allowed to know what came next. As they broke camp, Clara watched the draw they left behind, half expecting someone to appear and claim her return. And when no one did, the absence felt heavier than pursuit would have, because it left her alone with the truth that she was no longer being chased or discarded, but carried forward by choice. The road grew rougher, forcing them to dismount and walk in places, and Eli adjusted their pace without comment, matching it to her steps rather than his own, a consideration so quiet it nearly escaped notice, yet it stayed with her more than any promise could have. When they paused near midday, Clara finally asked the question that had been pressing against her since the rope fell, why he had intervened when he had nothing to gain. And Eli answered after a moment that some trouble could not be set down once it was seen clearly, and that leaving it behind only taught the world it was allowed to continue. The words unsettled her, because they placed responsibility where she had been taught to place blame, and she felt the old urge to argue for her own expendability rise again. She told him that the town would not forget, that accusations lingered even when they failed, and that his name would now be tied to hers in ways that could cost him work, land, or peace. And Eli acknowledged the cost without minimizing it, saying only that peace built on silence was a thin thing that did not hold when tested. As the afternoon wore on, a rider appeared briefly on a distant rise, watching without approaching, and Eli altered their course calmly, choosing cover over confrontation. And Clara saw then that protection was not bravado, but planning extended over time. The rider fell away, interest dulled by uncertainty, and the moment passed without incident. Yet Clara felt its weight settle, because it confirmed that the trouble he had chosen would follow them in quieter forms. When evening approached and the land opened into gentler ground, Clara understood that Eli had not taken her along to solve a problem quickly, but to shoulder a responsibility he had no intention of abandoning once it grew inconvenient. As they made camp again under a sky that promised another clear night, she realized that the trouble he had cut loose from the post was not something he intended to leave behind on the road, and for the first time, the thought did not fill her with fear, but with the tentative, unfamiliar sense that being carried forward did not require her to disappear in the process. By the 6th day on the road, Clara Wynne noticed a change not in their surroundings but in herself, in the way silence no longer pressed against her like an order to disappear, and the realization unsettled her more than fear ever had. She walked beside Eli Mercer now without counting her steps, no longer rehearsing apologies for occupying space, and when they paused, she did not immediately retreat into stillness, but waited, present, allowing the moment to exist without asking permission. Eli observed the shift without comment, adjusting his routines subtly, handing her tasks that assumed capability rather than testing it, and Clara felt the quiet weight of trust begin to replace the vigilance that had once governed every movement. They reached a stretch of open land where the road widened and visibility returned, and with it came the risk of being seen, not hunted but noticed, and Clara felt the familiar tightening in her chest as a wagon slowed in the distance, its driver's curiosity sharpening as he took in the unfamiliar pair. Eli met the moment calmly, stopping where he was visible and unhurried, his posture communicating certainty without explanation. And the wagon passed on after a brief glance, interest satisfied by the absence of uncertainty. The exchange lingered with Clara, because it showed her that protection did not always require confrontation, only the refusal to appear vulnerable to judgment. That evening, as they camped near a stand of cottonwoods, Clara spoke about the habit of shrinking, how silence had once been her safest response, and Eli listened, nodding once, as if acknowledging something he had seen long before she named it. He told her that silence chosen was different from silence enforced, and that learning the difference mattered more than learning how to speak loudly, and the distinction settled into her slowly, reshaping memories she had carried without examining. Later, as the fire burned low and the sounds of night gathered around them, Clara realized she was no longer listening for pursuit or waiting for instruction, but simply listening, allowing the world to exist without demanding her disappearance. She noticed how Eli kept watch without spectacle, his attention steady rather than tense, and she understood that his presence did not depend on her gratitude or obedience, only on the choice he had already made and continued to honor. When she lay down to rest, the ground felt firm beneath her in a way it never had before, not because danger had vanished, but because it had been answered consistently enough to lose its authority. In that quiet, Clara Wynne understood that silence no longer meant surrender, that staying visible without explanation was its own form of resistance, and that the rope had not only been cut from her wrists, but from the story she had been living inside, replaced now by a road that allowed her to exist fully, without apology, alongside someone who did not mistake her presence for trouble. Protection, Clara Wynne learned, had a shape, and it was not the one she had imagined during the long weeks when survival meant staying unnoticed. It did not announce itself or demand recognition, but settled into patterns so ordinary they were easy to miss. The way Eli Mercer chose camps that offered both shelter and visibility, the way he spoke to her before decisions instead of after them, the way he adjusted plans when her pace changed without making it a subject to be discussed. As they traveled farther from the town, Clara felt the pull of old instincts loosen, the urge to brace for correction fading as days passed without it, and the realization left her uncertain how to occupy a life that did not require shrinking. They reached a small settlement one afternoon, little more than a trading stop with a store and a few outbuildings, and Clara's steps slowed automatically, memory urging caution. But Eli did not tighten his grip or rush her through, instead moving at the same unhurried pace he always did, allowing the place to see them without flinching. Inside the store, conversation paused briefly as strangers took them in, not with hostility, but curiosity, and Clara felt the familiar heat rise in her chest until Eli spoke calmly with the proprietor, asking for supplies and offering payment without explanation. The moment passed without challenge, and as they stepped back into daylight, Clara realized her hands were no longer shaking because nothing had been demanded of her. Later, as they left the settlement behind, she asked him whether he ever worried that standing with her would cost him more than he expected, and Eli answered honestly that cost was only dangerous when it was denied, and that naming it made it manageable. The answer unsettled her because it reframed sacrifice as something chosen rather than endured, and she felt the quiet shift that came when protection was no longer something given temporarily, but a condition of shared movement forward. That night, as they camped beneath a sky untroubled by clouds, Clara understood that the shape of protection was not a wall or a weapon, but continuity. The refusal to abandon a decision once it became inconvenient, and she saw how that continuity had begun to reshape her own posture in the world. She sat closer to the fire without fear of taking warmth meant for someone else, spoke when she had something to say without rehearsing apology, and when sleep finally claimed her, it did so without the old tension that kept one ear open for judgment. Eli's presence remained steady, unremarkable in the way that true shelter always was, and Clara Wynne accepted that protection, once chosen, did not confine or diminish her, but allowed her to take up space without needing to justify it, a truth that had been waiting beyond the rope all along. The moment Clara Wynne realized the past was loosening its grip came quietly, without confrontation or declaration, on a morning when she woke and did not immediately count what might be taken from her before the day ended. The habit had been ingrained so deeply that its absence startled her, and she lay still for a moment, listening not for danger or pursuit, but for ordinary sounds. Eli Mercer moving near the fire, the horse shifting its weight, the wind threading through grass instead of judgment. As they broke camp, Clara noticed how her body moved differently now, shoulders no longer drawn inward, steps taken without calculation, and the change felt both liberating and disorienting, because it required her to trust something other than vigilance. They traveled through open land that day, visibility wide and honest, and Clara found herself looking outward instead of down, taking in the shape of the land as something she belonged within, rather than something she needed to slip through unnoticed. When they stopped to rest near midday, a pair of riders passed at a distance, glancing their way without slowing, and Clara felt only a brief flicker of the old fear before it faded, replaced by the recognition that attention no longer carried the same authority over her. Eli noticed the shift and said nothing, allowing the moment to stand on its own. And the restraint mattered, because it confirmed that her strength did not need to be acknowledged to be real. That afternoon, Clara spoke about the rope again, not with shame but with distance, describing it as something that had once defined her and now felt strangely unreal. And Eli listened with the same steady presence he always offered, neither anchoring her to the memory nor rushing her past it. He told her that the past only held power when it dictated the next step, and that walking forward without consulting it was how that power faded, and the simplicity of the truth settled into her more firmly than any reassurance could have. As evening approached, Clara realized she was no longer measuring how far they were from the town they had left behind, but how far they had come in ways that could not be marked on a map, and the thought brought with it a calm she had not known before. When night fell and the fire burned low, Clara Wynne rested without rehearsing explanations or defenses, understanding that the rope had lost its hold, not because it was cut once, but because she had continued walking away from it each day since, supported by a presence that did not require her to be smaller, to be safe. The moment Clara Wynne understood that the choice was no longer only Eli Mercer's came on an ordinary afternoon, when the road ahead forked and he slowed to let her see it, too, not as a test, but as acknowledgement that her direction mattered now. The gesture struck her harder than the rope ever had, because it asked something of her that survival never required before: the willingness to decide without surrendering responsibility back to someone else. She studied the two paths quietly, one leading toward settled land and familiarity, the other bending away into open country that promised fewer eyes, but more uncertainty. And for the first time, the decision did not feel like escape or exile, but preference. Clara realized then how often her life had been shaped by what others chose for her. Punishment disguised as order, protection offered only temporarily, and how rare it was to be invited into a future without conditions attached. She told Eli which path she preferred and why, her voice steady, unapologetic, and Eli accepted the answer without question, turning the horse as if the choice had always been hers to make. As they moved on, Clara felt something settle fully into place, because choosing herself did not require defiance or explanation, only clarity, and the absence of resistance confirmed that she was no longer being carried out of obligation alone. Later that day, they encountered a small group traveling in the opposite direction, and when one man glanced at Clara a moment too long, she met his eyes and did not look away, not in challenge but in presence, and the moment passed without consequence. Eli noticed but did not intervene, trusting her to stand where she now could, and the trust mattered more than protection ever had. That evening, as they camped beneath a sky streaked with color, Clara spoke about what it meant to choose herself without cutting ties to those who had helped her survive. And Eli told her that independence and belonging were not opposites, but something that could exist together when neither was forced. As the fire settled and the night grew still, Clara Wynne understood that the rope had once decided where she stood and how long she could remain. But now her place in the world was shaped by choices she could make and keep, supported rather than controlled by the man beside her. In that realization she felt the final weight lift, not because the past was erased, but because it no longer dictated the shape of what came next. By the time the land softened and the days lengthened, Clara Wynne no longer measured her worth by how quietly she could pass through a place, because the road had taught her something the rope never allowed: that dignity did not need permission to exist. Life with Eli Mercer settled into a rhythm that asked for presence rather than proof. Mornings shaped by work done side by side, evenings marked by shared quiet that did not demand explanation, and Clara felt the change most clearly in how her body occupied space without apology. She moved through camps and settlements without shrinking now, aware of eyes, but no longer ruled by them, and when questions came, they slid past her without cutting, because her sense of self was no longer anchored to the judgment of others. Eli remained steady, not as a guardian standing over her, but as a man who honored the choice he had made by continuing it, day after ordinary day, and Clara understood that protection, when it was real, did not cage or claim. It simply stayed. One evening, as they rested near a low ridge overlooking open ground, Clara spoke openly about the moment at the post, about how the rope had felt less frightening than the certainty in the voices around her, and Eli listened without interrupting, acknowledging the truth without trying to repair it. He told her that cutting the rope had never been about defying the town, but about refusing to accept a lie once he saw it clearly, and the words settled with finality because they did not ask her to be grateful or changed in return. As the fire burned low and the sky stretched wide above them, Clara realized that what had been unbound that day was not only her wrists, but the story she had been forced to live inside. One where her existence required justification and endurance was mistaken for worth. She no longer carried the urge to explain herself, because her life now contained continuity rather than interruption, and the steadiness of that truth was stronger than any accusation she had survived. When they eventually chose a place to stop, not because they were fleeing or hiding, but because the ground felt right, Clara understood that staying was no longer an act of fear, but of intention. She helped shape the space, planting, repairing, claiming it with care rather than defense, and the land responded in the quiet way it always did to consistency. Looking back, Clara knew the rope had been cut in a single motion, but freedom had been built through many small choices that followed, choices to walk, to speak, to remain visible without surrender. And as she stood beside Eli Mercer, unbound and unafraid, Clara Wynne accepted the truth that had once felt impossible, that she had never been trouble at all, and that what had changed everything was not the blade that freed her, but the decision, repeated daily, to let her life remain her own. If this story stayed with you, like it, share it, and subscribe to Echoes of a Rancher for quiet stories of love, redemption, and survival.